Good night, my dear Nell. His words sounded curiously irrelevant in that disturbed room. Indeed, to Nell's ears they sounded as if he had uttered them in an earthquake or a shipwreck. She could not take their meaning seriously. "You are not going," she said, raising her head and fixing upon his face her large, tear-wet, reproachful eyes. It seemed impossible to her, at that moment, that she was going to be deserted by her only real friend in the whole house. "Yes, I am, Nell dear," he answered, looking vaguely around for his coat and hat and stick. Dave Spear closed his book and jumped up. "I'll drive you in a jiffy," he said. "I've driven twice into town already tonight. In Percy's car, you know. I like driving. I like it very much." His words aroused Persephone from the semi-comatose state into which she had fallen, and she fixed upon him a tipsy stare. "Good Dave," she murmured, just as if he had been a dog. "Good, kind, thoughtful Dave. Yes, you fellows, yes, it's true, he can drive. He's quite right in saying that. He drives very nicely. I didn't teach him. The comrades in Bristol taught him. They said he must learn. He didn't like it when he first heard that, but he obeyed them. He always obeys them. He'd obey them if they told him to kill Philip." There's no reason why she should have brought in Philip, but something very deep in her nature was drowsily comparing the various people to whom she had given herself up to be enjoyed. "I'll never know what love is," she thought to herself. This thought came to her with such a strong feeling of having made a momentous discovery that she fancied she had spoken it out loud, and she looked around the room in a kind of shamefaced challenge to justify herself for so doing. Matt Decker waved his hand for Dave to sit down. He disregarded Persephone with studied discourtesy. Nell looked at him aghast. "You don't have to go, Mr. Decker," she cried, beginning to see that he actually was collecting his things. He spoke in a quiet voice now, but a voice that was resolute and final. "Yes, I've got to be getting home. But I love the walk, you know, that don't you, Nell? But I've got to be getting home, or Penny and Sam will be coming out to look for me among the Rhines of Splotsmoor." Now, this allusion to Sam was a wise and crafty one, worthy of any old Quantock shepherd. It brought their two dwellings near each other, and it softened his departure by involving her in his consideration for Sam and Sam's anxiety about him. Nell rose to her feet. "Well, if you must, you must," she said. "I shall never forget your goodness to me today, and always." Zoylan made a mock bow to the priest as the man passed him, carrying his surplice bag in one hand and his stick and hat in the other. Nell opened the door to let him out. "Good night, little girl," he murmured. "God bless you. God protect you." He added huskily as he strode off towards the river. She closed the door on his retreating figure and drew a miserable sigh. Percy still sat on in a tipsy daze. As for Will Zoyland, oh man, it just got dark in here. Fucking clouds. As for Will Zoyland, he seemed unable to stop talking nonsense to this sleepy but thoroughly placated infant. Little Harry's long-robed body lay contentedly now in Zookie's arms. She swung him to and fro as she leaned against the wall. "Harry says his christening cup hasn't been christened yet," cried Zoyland suddenly. With one of those impulsive, irrational angers that sometimes seize on drunkards, he turned fiercely upon Nell. "It's my cup! It's my father's cup!" He gabbled. Like that. "And I say the cup hasn't been christened yet. Harry's little cup. Harry says it must be christened." He moved with unsteady steps to the table. Here he picked up the cup and raising it to his mouth, tossed off its contents. "That's not christening, Will. That's only," mumbled Persephone in a drowsy voice. "You're right, my girl. You're always right." "It's wonderful how she's always right, isn't it, little Hal? It's my cup. It's my father's cup. It's got our falcon on it. My God, I'll christen it in the river water." He ran to the door, carrying the cup in his hand. Nell clung frantically to him, calling out repeatedly, "Are you mad, Will? What are you doing, Will? It's not yours, it's Harry's. It's Harry's, I tell you. Will! It's Harry's cup." But he wrenched himself loose from her and managed to get the door open. She followed him into the garden, and a breath of cold night air floated into their whiskey-smelling room. Dave stood there motionless, hesitating whether to follow them or not. How calm and impersonal looked that little book about Atlantis lying on the table face down and open. "Let un alone, Mr. Spear," cried Zuki. "'Twill only vex him worse for thee to meddle. Her can quite him. Him won't be hurt his lordship's golden mug." Percy looked dreamily at her husband while her eyelids sank down, open again, and sank down again. Her lulled and drugged senses had drifted back to the hay boat. Never had she felt like that before. Never had she given herself up like that before. She had not known the least little thing about love. No wonder people made so much of it, and priests called it mortal sin. "I'm sleepy," she thought. "I'd like to go to sleep in his arms. How strong he is. I'd like to melt away in his arms and sleep, and sleep, and sleep." Meanwhile, Nell was following Zoyland down the sloping lawn towards the river. She was wearing a tight-fitting lavender-colored dress with loose, beautifully cut sleeves. This particular dress she had seen in Wallop's widow, and Mr. Wallop, head seamstress, had worked hard to alter it for her, against the day when she came out of the hospital. She overtook him long before he reached the river bank, and clung to him desperately, and they struggled together, trampling upon her wild-flower bed and the last of the marjoram plants that were sinking down into the wet winter mold. In the struggle between them, for he kept holding the little cup high up in the air, and she kept dragging at his arms to reach it, it happened that one of her sleeves got caught in some way as they swayed together and was badly ripped, evoking as the fabric tore that particular sound which, of all others, the most agitating to a woman when she is struggling, whether in love or in hate, with a man. The tearing of her dress, and the ease with which Zoyland, even in his drunkenness, held the cup out of her reach, caused Nell to lose her self-control completely. She struck at his face again and again with her clenched hand, a proceeding which astonished him so much that he could only murmur, without attempting to defend himself, "Do it again, darling! Do it again, Nell!" It is a memorial epoch in a man's life, the first time a woman strikes him in anger. In most cases, a certain subtle link is broken between them that can never be mended. But there are exceptions to this. In the relations between men and women, the taking of virginity is undeniably the symbolic as well as the psychic root of all complications. This act causes pleasure to the one and suffering to the other. Therefore, when a woman strikes a man, a deeply hidden, basic relation is broken, and broken in a manner that, as a rule, is dangerous for both. The Reverend Dr. Sodbury, rector of St. Benignus, who was Megan Gird's favorite among God's ministers, as the lady put it, in all Glaston, in an eloquent sermon preached on the occasion when Mrs. Legg of Camelot, then in the prime of her life, was summoned for violently striking the father of Mr. Wallop, spoke of there being something in a woman's striking, a man that was monstrous, perverted, unnatural, forbidden, impious, shocking, obscene, and the worthy doctor in his original manuscript had added the word bestial. But in a later version he had modified that into more proper to the insect world than to the world of humanity. Do it again, darling. Do it again, Nell. Zoyland was debarred from making any serious attempt to defend himself from these blows, not only by gallantry, but also by his obstinate efforts, naturally to the gravity of drunkenness, to keep the cup far out of her reach. Into her blows Nell threw all the mounting tide of her feelings that had been gathering and gathering against Zoyland ever since Sam gave up making love to her, ever since her child's conception began. To the end of her life she remembered what she felt as she hit him. It was the sight of his beard in the moonlight, more than anything else, that made her repeat her blows so often. In each blow, as she felt the flesh, she struck at yield in her knuckles, seemed to avenge her, and liberate her, and heal some deep hurt in her, and fulfill some profound necessity of her nature. It was as if she was striking something more than Zoyland. It was as if she was striking at that whole procession of rank, hirsute, brutal, and abominable men that she had seen that day, when in the first recognition of her maternity she had burnt up her brother's pamphlet. It was as if she were striking with her schoolgirl hand all that unfair advantage that men possessed over women in this world, their easy escapes, their light-hearted irresponsibility, their shifting of burdens, their abysmal conceit. How she had hated that thud, thud, thud of her husband's heavy steps coming down those stairs. Well, it was with another thud, thud, thud of her woman's knuckles against his bearded face that she had countered that. It was not, of course, that the girl had time to feel all this in sequence, but she did feel the overpowering impetus of all this as she struck her blows. The tearing of her dress was the raising of the sluice, and the flood simply followed. The truth seemed to be that the attraction between men and women let down a drawbridge across a fretting current of hopeless differences that has only to be exposed to lead at once to these wild outbursts. Exposed to lead at once to these wild outbursts. Not lead, lead. As long as she had not met Sam or known that there was a Sam in the world, there was enough sensuality in her to make Zoyland a tolerable partner. But when Sam and Sam's child came between them, Zoyland was thrust at once into that category of unilluminated maleness towards which it takes a born courtesan to be indulgent. It was the appearance of Dave Spear's figure now, for the imperial personalist had decided to disobey Zoogie, that drove the tipsy giant to his next move. "I said I'd christen 'ee, little cup," he roared, "and so I will. How do you like that?" So speaking, he ran down the slope of the moonlit lawn, treading carelessly on her rain-beaten patch of rosemary, and flung the golden cup clear into the middle of the misty stream. There was a shriek of astounded dismay from Nell, and a cry, "What on earth?" from the bewildered communist. And with a much smaller splash than anyone would have expected, in fact with hardly any splash at all, the Doll's House Grail, as Mr. Evans had called it when he sold it to Lord P., sank down to the bottom of White Lake River. The spasm of her anger all spent now, only a sick disgust at his folly remained in Nell's mind. But this was enough to give her the final push, so that she had been gathering up her courage to do all that agitated evening. She had not missed, no woman could have missed, not even one who loved another, the vibrant aura of infatuation between Zoyland and Percy. It had been her vision of their two faces as they drank that whiskey that had tipped the scale. "Will," she said very quietly, when the two men, the one approaching her from the house and the one from the river, met at her side. "Will, listen." "I am listening, and so's brother Dave listening," jeered Soyland. But she went on in a steadily ice-cold voice. "I am going to leave you," she said. "I'm going to leave you now, tonight. Dave is going to drive Baby and me to where I tell him, but that's not for you." "It is for you. Yes, I'm going to do the vicarage. Mr. Decker will take me in. I've had enough of this sort of thing, Will. But, she hesitated for a second. "But, I'm sorry I hit you. I oughtn't to have done that. I don't know what came over me." Lord P's bastard drew a deep breath. The light from the drifting half-moon made his great bushy beard look twice as big as it did by day, and his figure twice as formidable. But passed through his mind like a falling star was the thought of Percy's naked body, alone with him in that little silent house. "Very well, Nell," he said, as quiet and composed as a man could be. "Very well, Nell." "I shall leave Mrs. Pippard here," she went on. "You can keep her on, or let her go, just as you like." "I'm listening, Nell," he repeated. "Very well, Nell." But she turned to her brother now. "Dave," she said humbly and gently. "Dear Dave, I'm sorry to drag you into all this. Besides, I know what we both..." "Oh, it's all right, Nellie," Dave cried hurriedly, anxious about everything to stop her from referring to Percy before Zoyland. "We'll get off at once. Don't you fret. We'll get off at once. Decker's a fast walker. He'll be home before we're there. Don't you fret, Nellie. The vicarage won't hurt you for one night anyway. And we can see later. We can all talk, reasonably and quietly, later. And try and see things later. Outside our own skin." This expression, outside her own skin, came suddenly into Dave's head. It was his personal reaction from all this long day spent in stroking the electric skins of so many personalized animals. Stroking the electric skins of so many personalized animals. That's a good phrase. "Don't you fret, little Nell." How many times in her earlier life had this absent-minded half-brother uttered those words? They brought more comfort to her now in her distress and her shame than she would have thought possible if she could have foreseen how this day was going to end. Dave put his arm slyly and stiffly around her waist. There were no directions in the Marxian philosophy, nor indeed in his Atlantis book, telling a reformer of society how to comfort a woman. But between his sister's soft waist and her torn sleeve and his own arm just then, there seemed to be something spontaneously generated which was outside the sphere of reason. Not more than an hour later, Mrs. William Zoyland and Master Henry Sagamore Rollo Zoyland were safely deposited, together with a modicum of luggage, on the steps of the vicarage front door. It was the vicar himself who opened the door to let them in. The child, disturbed by the ceasing of the movement of the car, began to cry loudly. In spite of her agitation, his mother could not help recalling how, when they left White Lake Cottage to the tune of Zuki Pippard's "Oo tu dri vor," her husband had said, "I know one person will miss me, Nell, in that monastery of yours," and how tenderly he had brushed the baby's face with his great yellow beard. As for Dave Spear, he was free that night to read his Atlantis book till the candle in Dickie Cantle's third back bedroom burnt to the socket. But he read only 3 pages. It is hard to be impersonal in a cosmos that runs to personality. Well, that's the end of that chapter. That was chapter The Christening. Next we'll have the next chapter, which is the Saxon Arch. The Saxon Arch. Next time in Glastonbury. Till then, cheers.